the ultimate transatlantic giant of the Third Reich, designed for a non-stop strike on New York directly from Europe. Friends, today in our spotlight is the Messerschmitt Me 264, the ambitious Amerika Bomber, which became one of the most mysterious aviation projects of the era of global confrontation. Was this aircraft really prepared for a secret escape of the Führer to Japan in the event of the regime's collapse? How did the designers manage to achieve a record range of 20,000 kilometers? And why, in the midst of a resource crisis, did they try to install an experimental steam turbine on the bomber? Watch the video to the end to learn how German engineers planned to make this aircraft fly on a mixture of coal and gasoline, and what buried the transatlantic strike project forever. Let's begin. 1937, Munich. The design bureau of the Messerschmitt Company. A drawing with the working designation P.1061 lies on the table. There is nothing loud about this combination of letters and numbers.
On paper, it is a 4-engine aircraft for record-breaking flights, with a range of about 20,000 kilometers. This is enough to fly almost half of the Earth's equator without a single landing. The customer is the Reich Air Ministry, the department on whose decisions the fate of any German aircraft depended in those years. The official goal of the project sounds beautiful and understandable to everyone: to establish a world record for flight range. And now, the second line of the same technical specification, almost unnoticed, as if written in small print. If necessary, the aircraft could be used for strategic reconnaissance. The difference between these two formulations is the whole story. A record is about newspapers and prestige, while reconnaissance is a completely different conversation. And it is from this second, modest line that a project will grow a few years later, which we will talk about for the next hour. For now, the designers of the Messerschmitt Company are thinking neither about reconnaissance, nor, even less, about delivering cargo across the ocean. Their question is much more practical and difficult. How to keep a 4-engine machine in the air for more than 24 hours in a row when there is nothing but water below and not a single airfield for an emergency landing for thousands of kilometers around. A range of 20,000 kilometers is not just a line in a specification table. It means long hours of blind flying when the only reference point below is the horizon line and nothing else. Today, a transatlantic flight is a boring routine and a ticket purchased in a couple of clicks. In 1937, the very idea of flying across an entire ocean in a single aircraft and returning safely seemed like science fiction on the verge of madness to many. Yet, the Messerschmitt Bureau takes on this task. The project receives approval from the ministry, the drawings go to work, and the calculations for the wing and fuel tanks begin. But before long, this very project will find itself one step away from a complete halt. The reason will be so mundane that it is hard to believe. The drawings went into the archive, not the trash bin, but the archive, marked "postponed until further notice." By the end of the 1930s, the situation in Europe was changing rapidly. Messerschmitt factories received orders that could not be delayed for a single day. Bf-109 and Bf-110 fighters were needed immediately and in huge quantities. Imagine the same workshop in different months. Yesterday, they were drawing a wing with a span of almost 40 meters for a record-breaking 4-engine giant. Today, in this same workshop, engineers are calculating parts for fighters. The count is no longer in units, but in hundreds. Priorities change in a matter of months, and the Air Ministry sends a short order of just a few lines. Suspend the development of the long-range reconnaissance aircraft. No explanations as to why now, no date for when work would resume. Just a pause with no end on paper. It is easy to imagine a short conversation in the design bureau in those days. What about the long-range reconnaissance aircraft project? Frozen. Priority is fighters. And where do the drawings go? To the archive, until better times. Except no one in this bureau knows whether these better times will ever come. For the engineers, this looks like the quiet end of an ambitious idea. Years of calculations, dozens of tested solutions, all of this lies on a shelf under a layer of paper dust. A familiar feeling, isn't it? When an important project is put off until there is time, and the time never appears. For the Messerschmitt Company in those months, things were exactly like that. But here, a rule applies that the engineers do not yet realize. Sometimes a pause is not the end of the story, but simply the silence before events pick up speed again.
While the drawings of the long-range reconnaissance aircraft gather dust in the archive, something happens across the ocean that will soon bring these drawings back to light, faster than anyone in the design bureau could have anticipated. The archive folder is open again. Someone in the Air Ministry takes out those very drawings designated P.1061 and places them back on the designer's desk. The reason is simple. The global situation has changed so much that the old idea is suddenly needed again, but this time for a different purpose. The project receives a new name, not a dry technical designation, but a name in which the entire intent is immediately heard: Amerika Bomber. Listen to this word. There is not a single extra letter in it. It explains the task by itself without any additional explanation: to fly across the ocean and return. It is easy to imagine what the call to the designer sounded like that day. The project is back in work. The same aircraft? The same airframe, a different task, and time is running out. Just yesterday, it was about a range record for the sake of prestige in newspaper headlines. Now, that same range of 20,000 kilometers turns into a military calculation where the stakes are not a record, but a completely different price of error. It is as if today a racing car built for a speed record suddenly had to be converted into a vehicle for a real combat mission. The frame is the same, but the meaning is completely different. New technical requirements land on the designer's desks one after another. No longer a record machine, it is now an aircraft with a specific point on the map to fly to and a cargo to deliver there. And the very idea of flying across an entire ocean in 1941 still sounds almost like science fiction. No satellite navigation, no accurate weather forecasts midway, no airfield for refueling. Only calculations, a compass, and a fuel supply that must last for dozens of hours of nonstop flight. Was it even worth taking on such a task? The designers of the Messerschmitt Company answer this question with action rather than words. They return to the drawings and start calculating anew. But now, they no longer have an abstract record machine before them. They are looking at a very specific aircraft, where every detail must work toward a single goal. And it is this design, detail by detail, that we will analyze right now. Imagine standing next to this aircraft on the airfield. The first thing that catches your eye is the fuselage. Not a familiar angular box, but a smooth, almost streamlined body of circular cross-section. The designers chose an all-metal layout. No fabric, no wood, only metal from nose to tail. The shapes are subordinated to a single task: minimal air resistance during dozens of hours of continuous flight. Look at the tail. 2 fins instead of 1, a solution that immediately reveals something unusual about this machine. And now, a detail that is easy to pass by without noticing. The control surfaces of this aircraft are deflected not by cables or rods, but by electric actuators. For the mid-20th century, this was almost exotic. Most aircraft of that era were controlled by the raw physical strength of the pilot through a system of levers. Here, however, an electrical signal transmits the command across dozens of meters almost instantly. It is as if today the familiar handbrake lever in a car were replaced with a button. The logic is the same, but the execution is fundamentally different. The wing of this aircraft is striking in its high aspect ratio. It is narrow and long, as if specially stretched for a single purpose: to stay in the air as long as possible, spending as little fuel as possible for each kilometer flown. The entire trailing edge of this wing is occupied by control surfaces: ailerons for roll control, flaps for takeoff and landing, not a single centimeter of free space. And inside the wing lies the main secret of the range. The primary fuel supply is placed there, in wing tanks stretched across almost the entire span. Look lower toward the ground. The landing gear of this machine is tricycle style, 2 main gear legs and 1 under the nose. And on each leg there is only a single wheel. It sounds simple, almost mundane, but it is this simple solution that will create problems for the designers every time the takeoff weight of the machine, fully loaded with fuel and cargo, is discussed. Now, looking at the drawing, all of this looks logical and well thought out. Electric actuators, a narrow wing, compact landing gear, solutions that were supposed to make the aircraft lighter and more efficient. But one person in the Air Ministry will soon question not just individual details of the design, but the very existence of this aircraft as a whole. The beginning of 1942. The military situation on the fronts is changing faster than the plans of the designers in the rear can adapt. On the desk of Erhard Milch, deputy head of the Air Force, lies a short note of just a few lines. But these lines are enough to erase months of work by an entire design bureau. The decision is simple and harsh. The number of experimental aircraft under construction is reduced to 3. Just 3 airframes. 3 chances to prove that the 4-engine giant, conceived back in 1937, is capable of performing its task. Imagine for a second what it is like to invest years of calculations and thousands of hours of work by engineers and draftsmen, only to find out that only a third of the planned prototypes will remain. The cold arithmetic of the ministry leaves no room for sentiment. But the decision does not end there. In February of the same year, a much more radical idea appears on the table: to transfer the entire development to another company, Dornier. It is easy to imagine a short conversation in the ministry's office in those days. Is Messerschmitt failing to keep up the pace? They are keeping up, but Dornier might have free capacity sooner. And if they don't, then we will find out in practice. They had to find out quickly. Dornier's capacities turned out to be loaded to the limit. Not a single free production line, not a single hour of downtime in the workshops. The question of transferring the project dropped by itself, just as suddenly as it had appeared. Here we should pause and ask one question. What would have happened if Dornier had agreed to this transfer back then? Would the 4-engine giant have had a different fate? Or would the same drawings have simply landed on a different desk in another city under a different classification? We will never know the exact answer. History does not leave drafts to test alternative scenarios. It is somewhat like a situation where a major project within a company is almost outsourced to another contractor, only to reveal that the latter simply has no free hands, and the project remains where it started. But the fact remains, the program survived not due to strong support from above, but rather in spite of an almost finalized decision to give it away to others. 3 prototype aircraft, that is all that remained of the initial scope of the project. 3 chances for success instead of the much larger number originally planned. And the first of these 3 machines was already being assembled in the workshops of a small town near Ulm. It was there, a year earlier, that the history of this specific aircraft began, the one that would soon lift off the ground for the first time. A small town of Neu-Offingen near Ulm, 1941. It is here, in the production workshops, that the assembly of the very aircraft whose drawings we have already analyzed in detail begins. The work does not go quickly. Every detail of this machine is custom built, not mass produced. No conveyor belt, no flow, only the manual fitting of hundreds of components to one another. By the end of 1942, the first prototype is ready. It has its own radio code, RE+NN. Not just numbers on paper, but a physical machine standing on the airfield. By design, this specific machine was supposed to do something that still seemed almost impossible for a single aircraft of that time: fly to New York and deliver 1,800 kilograms of cargo. Consider the scale of this task for a second. Thousands of kilometers over the open ocean without a single alternate airfield, and without the right to make a mistake in fuel calculations. This aircraft was supposed to attack from an altitude inaccessible to the fighters of that time. The idea was simple. If the enemy cannot climb that high, they cannot intercept the machine. And now, a detail that is truly chilling. This aircraft has no defensive armament. Not a single machine gun, not a single cannon, not a single firing point. The decision was dictated by cold calculation. Every kilogram of armament is extra weight, and extra weight means less fuel, less range, and fewer chances to reach the target in return. Imagine yourself in the place of the pilot of such a machine. You are flying alone across the ocean, knowing that if an enemy fighter appears, you have nothing to answer with. Your only protection is altitude and speed, and nothing else. It is like setting out on a long voyage on a ship without a single cannon on board, relying solely on the hope that the enemy simply will not catch up with you. A bold decision, or a desperate one? The answer is probably somewhere in the middle. The first prototype stands on the airfield, ready to prove that such a strategy can work. But to understand what this aircraft was like inside, what engines carried it over the ocean, how its fuselage was designed, we need to look under the skin. Let us look under the skin of the first prototype. What we find there explains why this machine was called only a testbed and not a combat aircraft. To speed up the work, the designers did not wait for the development of special engines. They installed what was already proven and available: 4 liquid-cooled Jumo 211 J-1 engines. The radiators for these engines were borrowed from another machine, the Junkers Ju-88 A-4 bomber. This was a practical but temporary solution, and both sides understood this perfectly. On takeoff, each engine developed 1,340 horsepower, an impressive figure, but only for the short moment of launch. At an altitude of 6,000 meters, where the machine was supposed to spend most of its long flight, the power dropped to 1,060 horsepower per engine. The air there is thin, and the engine simply lacks oxygen to work fully. Now let us look inside the fuselage. The designers divided it into 3 separate sections, like 3 carriages of one long train. The nose section was the flight deck for the crew, with a large glazed area. From here, the pilots could see almost everything happening around the aircraft. The center section was the most densely packed part of the aircraft. It housed the bomb bay, with a walkway above, a rest area for the crew, and the passage to the tail section of the machine. Think about it for a second. A crew flying for dozens of hours in a row needed not only control instruments, but also a place where they could lie down at least briefly. This rest compartment was not a luxury, but a necessity for a flight of many hours. The tail section ended with an observer's position, the eyes of the machine looking backward, from where an enemy might appear. And now, about the fuel supply. The main volume was hidden in self-sealing fuel tanks protected against simple punctures, as much as 13,800 liters, plus another 5,800 liters in unprotected tanks. In total, this is almost 19,600 liters of fuel for a single aircraft. To put this scale in perspective, this is enough fuel to fill several hundred ordinary passenger cars. All these figures and technical decisions were subordinated to a single goal: to stay in the air as long as possible without a single landing. The first prototype was ready. It remained only to lift this giant into the sky and check whether all of this worked in practice as well as on paper. December 1942, the airfield near Ulm. 4 Jumo 211 engines start, one by one, and the massive machine slowly begins its takeoff run. The first flight has taken place. This was the moment the designers had been waiting for more than a year, ever since the first parts of the fuselage were laid on the assembly jigs. It would seem like a triumph. A multi-ton machine with a wingspan of almost 40 meters lifts off the ground and stays in the air. But here we must stop and say directly what is often overlooked. This flight was not a test of a combat aircraft. It was a test of a flying test bed and nothing more. According to the project itself, even at the drawing stage, the first prototype was never intended to be a fully fledged combat aircraft. It was only supposed to answer one question: whether this design was capable of staying in the air at all. No defensive armament, no armor, no equipment required for a real combat mission across the ocean. Just an airframe, a wing, and 4 temporary engines borrowed from another aircraft. Ask yourself, what did this flight actually prove? The answer is sobering. It proved only that the aerodynamic design worked, nothing more and nothing less. And while this machine was making its first circles over the airfield, the whole picture of the conflict was changing far across the ocean, much faster than the assembly of a single prototype aircraft. By the time the first prototype's wheels touched the concrete after landing, the requirements for which this machine was originally designed were already outdated. The world did not stand still while the engineers near Ulm refined their only flying test bed. And very soon, it would become clear that not only the aircraft itself was outdated, but also the entire concept for which it was created. While the first prototype was making its test flights over the airfield near Ulm, the event across the ocean had already occurred. The United States officially entered the global conflict. This is not just a line in a history textbook. For the program we are discussing, this event became a turning point. In the technical department of the Air Ministry, a new concept of the Amerika Bomber program was finally taking shape, and this concept was much harsher than anything previously laid down in the project. The requirements sounded simple in words, but were extremely difficult in practice. The aircraft needed effective defensive armament and an increased bomb load. Remember the 6th section. The first prototype was to fly across the ocean without a single defensive barrel, relying only on altitude and speed. Now this strategy was officially recognized as insufficient. A question arises that the engineers asked themselves with slight anxiety: how to combine defensive armament, a crew to service it, and an increased bomb load, while still maintaining a flight range of thousands of kilometers across the ocean. The only answer on paper is that 4 engines are no longer enough. 6 are needed. It is as if a car buyer suddenly demanded twice as much cargo capacity and additional armor on the body from the same vehicle, while asking to keep the same fuel consumption per 100 kilometers. Technically, combining all these requirements within the old 4-engine layout was virtually impossible. A fundamentally different aircraft was needed. And this is where the most interesting part begins. The new technical specification is distributed to several design bureaus simultaneously, not only to Messerschmitt, but also to their direct competitors. 3 major aircraft manufacturing companies in Germany simultaneously take on the same task, each in its own way, each with its own vision of the solution. An unspoken competition begins, and the stakes are not just a production contract. The stakes are which machine will ultimately win the right to be called the true Amerika Bomber. 3 design bureaus, 3 answers to the same technical specification. Let us look at each of them in turn. Focke-Wulf comes out with a project designated TA400. This is not a machine designed from scratch, but a development of an existing design, the FW300A project, adapted to the new requirements of a 6-engine layout. Junkers offers its answer, the 6-engine Junkers JU390. And there is an important detail here, which we will mention a little later. This machine is not completely new from scratch, but a logical development of an already proven design. And finally, the Messerschmitt company, the very one whose project we are analyzing, comes out with a 6-engine version of its own machine, designated ME264B. 3 projects, 3 design philosophies, the same goal: to fly across the ocean with full armament on board. Now comes the decisive moment. The technical department of the Air Ministry makes its choice, and this choice does not fall on the Messerschmitt project. Preference is given to the Junkers JU390. The reason for this decision is not at all the superiority of the aircraft's performance characteristics. The reason is much more mundane. The Junkers JU390 had high structural compatibility with another aircraft of the same company, the Junkers JU290, which was already in serial production in the city of Bernburg. Consider what this means in practice. No need to rebuild factory lines from scratch. No need to retrain workers for a completely new assembly technology. Just an expansion of an already established production. It is as if a major company chose not the most innovative product from a third-party developer, but a solution that is easiest to integrate into an existing production chain, faster, cheaper, and more predictable. And what does Messerschmitt receive, whose 6-engine project was passed over by the ministry? Not a complete rejection, but rather a change of task. The 2nd and 3rd prototypes, the very machines already under construction near Ulm, are proposed to be converted, not into a long-range bomber for an attack across the ocean, but into long-range maritime reconnaissance aircraft. Was this ministry decision worth abandoning a machine whose development had been underway for several years? One question hangs in the air without an answer. Did the boldest project win this competition, or simply the one most convenient for the assembly line? The fate of the 2nd and 3rd prototypes will now follow a completely different path, and this path will turn out to be much less successful than might have been assumed. The 2nd prototype has been standing in the workshop near Ulm for a long time, longer than anyone had originally calculated. Formally, its design differs little from the first machine, which we have already analyzed in detail. The same fuselage, the same high aspect ratio wing, the same general layout. But the fate of this prototype will be completely different. The reason for the delay is simple and at the same time agonizing for the designers. The final technical requirements from the technical department of the Air Ministry only appear in March 1943. Imagine the position of the engineers in those months. The airframe is almost ready, standing in the workshop waiting for final decisions from above, and the decisions do not come. It is easy to imagine a short conversation in the design bureau of those days. What about the final requirements for the 2nd prototype? The ministry has not approved them yet. But the airframe is ready, the engines are ready. Are we just waiting for a paper? Exactly so. We are waiting for a paper. And in March, the paper finally arrives. The requirements turn out to be more serious than anything before. Instead of the previous liquid-cooled Jumo 211 engines that were on the first prototype, the second is to receive completely different motors, 14-cylinder BMW 801D engines, equipped with the GM1 boost system. A boost system is a way to sharply increase engine power for a short time by injecting an additional compound into the combustion chamber. This solution gives the machine a reserve of power at critical moments, during takeoff with a full load or when escaping danger. In addition to the engines, the requirements include serious crew and technical protection. 1,000 kilograms of armor must protect the engines, the crew, and the defensive gun installations. Think about this figure. 1,000 kilograms is a weight comparable to a small passenger car, distributed in thin armored plates over the most vulnerable nodes of the machine. The requirements do not end with armor. They include the installation of full defensive armament, photographic equipment for reconnaissance tasks, a separate compartment for radio buoys, devices dropped into the water to transmit signals for navigation or target detection, and lighting bombs for nighttime operations. The list is impressive. Practically a full-fledged combat aircraft, not a testbed like the first prototype. But a decision is made here that explains a lot about the actual pace of the program in those months. They decide to finish the second prototype without defensive armament and without most of this equipment. All of this is postponed to the third prototype, which by then is seen as the real prototype for the future production model. Why? The answer is simple and pragmatic. The second prototype is already heavily delayed. Installing a full set of armament and equipment would mean months of additional work. It is easier to complete the machine in a simplified form, test at least the new engines and the general design in action, and transfer all combat functionality to the next, third airframe. By the end of 1943, the second prototype is finally ready, but not for flight, for ground tests. Imagine this moment, a year and a half of waiting for the final requirements, months of assembly, dozens of engineering decisions, and now the machine stands on the airfield, ready to undergo its first serious systems check directly on the ground, before even lifting into the air. And at this very moment, when only weeks or perhaps days remain before the first flight, something happens that erases all this work in a single blow. Allied aviation launches a bombing strike on the area where the machine is located. The second prototype, the very one that was supposed to receive the powerful new engines and become a step forward compared to the first, is destroyed before it could lift into the sky even once. It is worth pausing to realize the bitterness of this moment. The machine was built to fly high, carry defensive armament, and protect itself and its crew with armor weighing 1,000 kilograms. But neither the armor nor the future armament saved it where it stood, on the ground, defenseless against an airstrike that it was designed to avoid in the future. It is like preparing a reliable shield for a future battle, but losing it in the warehouse before it can ever be used. The second prototype never lifted into the air, not even once. A year and a half of work, dozens of ministry decisions, a complex system of new engines, all of this was cut short by a single air raid on the ground near Ulm. Only one prototype remained, the third, and the entire weight of expectations now fell on it, from the defensive armament to the full set of combat equipment that they did not have time to install on its predecessor. Work on it continues despite everything, and this machine, like its predecessor, receives extended wingtips, the wingspan increases from 39 to 43 meters. 4 meters of wingspan may sound like a small number, but imagine the difference. This is roughly the length of 2 passenger cars placed end to end, added to each wing. This is an increase that noticeably changes the lifting properties of the machine at high altitudes. Now, the armament, the very thing the second prototype never received. The front upper turret receives a 13mm MG131 machine gun. The rear upper turret receives a much more serious 20mm MG151 cannon. In the nose glazing, another MG131 machine gun. On the sides of the fuselage, 2 of the same machine guns, protecting the machine from the flanks. And in the lower part, in a special ventral gondola, a 20mm MG151 cannon. Count with me. 3 firing points with machine guns, 2 with cannons. 5 directions of simultaneous protection. Forward, backward, sideways from both sides, and downward. Compare this with the first prototype, which flew across the ocean without a single defensive weapon. The difference is not just noticeable, it is fundamental. To operate all this armament, fly the machine, and work with the equipment, the crew of the third prototype grew to 8 people. 8 people on board a single machine, flying for many hours across the ocean. This is no longer just an aircraft, but a flying station with a full division of duties. In the rear of the bomb bay, 3 automatic RB50/30 cameras are installed. The reconnaissance function, laid down in the project on the very first page of the technical specification back in 1937, finally receives real expression. The bomb bay itself is capable of holding up to 2,000 kilograms of bombs, twice as much as the specification for the very first prototype. And now, a detail that says a lot about the actual weight of this machine when fully loaded. For takeoff with an overload, additional jettisonable wheels are provided on the main landing gear legs. The logic is simple. During the takeoff run, the additional wheels help distribute the load and ease the start of the heavy machine. After takeoff, they are simply jettisoned so as not to carry extra weight across the entire ocean. And one more element completes the picture. 6 takeoff rocket boosters, each with a thrust of 1,000 kilograms. Imagine the simultaneous firing of 6 such boosters at the moment of the takeoff run, additional thrust that was literally supposed to push the overloaded machine into the sky on a short stretch of runway. Of all 3 built machines, this one is the most complete, the most thought out, and the closest to the real combat aircraft envisioned 6 years ago. But the closer the machine comes to its combat readiness, the more bitter what happens to it next will be. While the third prototype was being assembled in the workshop near Ulm, dozens of other variants of this same machine lay on the designer's drawing boards. None of them ever lifted into the air. The first variant featured 4 Jumo 213 engines, an upgraded version of the same engine family that stood on the very first prototype, only more powerful and modern. The second variant was designed with 4 BMW 801E or 801G engines, essentially a further development of the same line of motors that was supposed to stand on the lost second prototype. To this variant, they added 2 Jumo 004 turbojets. Imagine this combination for a second. Piston engines work during cruise flight, and the turbojets are switched on when a sharp increase in speed or power is needed. This is a hybrid scheme that, in spirit, resembles solutions that appeared in serious commercial aviation only decades after these drawings. The third variant went even further. 4 BMW 801 TJ engines plus 2 BMW 018 turbojets. The same hybrid power plant logic, just with a different set of motors. And BMW's engineers went one step further. They calculated a variant with 2 BMW 028 turboprop engines. A turboprop engine is not just a jet engine and not just a piston engine. It is a gas turbine that drives a propeller through a reduction gear, combining the efficiency of the turbine with the thrust of a conventional propeller. Such a scheme only became widely adopted in civil and military transport aviation in the 50s and 60s. Here, in the calculations of German engineers, this idea exists already in the early 40s. Separately stands another variant of the entire machine, a version with 6 DB603 engines, which received the working designation P.1075. The company's chief designer, Willy Messerschmitt, campaigned for this version to receive its own official production index, the ME364, not just a modification of the old machine, but a virtually new aircraft with its own name in the ministry documents. Pause for a second and imagine this multitude of variants simultaneously. 4 different power plants for the same airframe, hybrid schemes with jet engines, and a completely separate 6-engine version claiming its own name. It is like a company archive where dozens of parallel technical solutions exist for the same task, and neither the developers nor the management manage to choose one because circumstances change faster than the work progresses. None of these versions left the drawing board. Not a single one of these engines, including the boldest hybrid and turboprop schemes, ever lifted a real machine of this family into the air. All of these ideas and calculations remained lying next to the completed third prototype as unfulfilled variants of the same destiny. And very soon, a single decision from above will put an end to all these versions simultaneously, leaving no chance for any of them. The beginning of 1944. None of the dozens of variants we have just analyzed ever went into production. And the reason for this is not the designers, the drawings, or the technical solutions. The reason is much simpler and much more inexorable. Strategic raw materials. Metals for the engines, materials for the construction, fuel for the future production aircraft. All of this was required in huge quantities for a program of this scale. And at the beginning of 1944, the supply of these raw materials no longer allowed any hope for serial production of the machine. Think for a second about the difference between these two reasons for stopping a project. A technical failure is one thing. It says that the idea was flawed from the start. But here the situation is completely different. The machine flew. The third prototype was almost ready, armed, with an 8-man crew and a well-thought-out design. The problem was not the aircraft. The problem was that there were physically not enough resources to build more than a few of these machines. It is as if a product completely ready for production is stopped, not because it is bad, but because the raw materials for its mass production at the factory have run out. The program is closed, officially, quietly, without loud statements, even before the third prototype could complete its full test cycle. Pause and calculate with me how many years were spent on this path. The first drawings under the designation P.1061 date back to 1937. The official closure of the program was at the beginning of 1944. 7 years of work, counting from the very beginning. 7 years. Dozens of engineers, 3 built prototypes, one of which was lost on the ground before its first flight. More than a dozen developed power plant schemes, including turboprop and hybrid jet options that were a good decade ahead of their time. And all of this stops not with a loud failure or a disaster in the air, but with a dry administrative phrase about a shortage of raw materials. One stroke of the pen in a ministry document and 7 years of work are closed without the right to continue. A familiar feeling if you think about it. A major project into which the time and effort of many people have been invested is shut down not because the idea was wrong, but because the resources for its implementation have run out. This happens in much more ordinary, peaceful areas as well. It would seem like the end of the story. The program is closed, the drawings are archived, this time forever. But this story has one more chapter, and it turns out to be much stranger than anything we have already analyzed. July 1944. The program has been officially closed for 6 months. But it is at this moment that a story appears on the airwaves that has nothing to do with the technical reports of the ministry. An unknown German radio station reports something unexpected. According to this version, the aircraft was prepared in case of a coup attempt by rebel generals to transport the country's top leadership to Japan. Whether this is true or not is impossible to say for sure today. Not a single document confirms or refutes this version unambiguously. The rumor remained a rumor, hanging somewhere between official history and urban legend. But while this rumor was spreading on the airwaves, the fate of the only surviving prototype, the very first flying testbed, had already been decided, and decided long before this radio message. The program was closed, but the machine itself, the first prototype, physically continued to exist. And someone had to decide what to do with the multi-ton airframe, which only recently had been the pinnacle of engineering thought for an entire company. The machine is transferred to the Maschinen company for a completely different task, flight testing of a steam turbine. Think for a second about how unexpected this sounds. An aircraft designed around 4 and then 6 piston engines suddenly becomes a flying laboratory for a technology that operates on a completely different principle. This steam turbine was supposed to develop a power of 6,000 horsepower at 6,000 revolutions per minute, a figure comparable to the power of several conventional aircraft engines of that time, combined in a single unit. The turbine drove a propeller with a diameter of 5.3 meters, rotating it at a frequency of 400,500 revolutions per minute, or, in another version, a smaller propeller with a diameter of 2 meters, but at a much higher 6,000 revolutions per minute. And now, perhaps the most unusual detail of this whole story. The engine was supposed to run on a mixture of coal dust and gasoline, in a proportion of 65% coal to 35% gasoline. Imagine this picture for a second. An aircraft originally created to fly across the ocean on pure aviation fuel is turned into a flying furnace where ordinary coal dust is mixed with gasoline to power a steam turbine. This was a test of a technology ahead of its time, an attempt to combine aviation with the principle of a steam engine at a moment when strategic raw materials had practically run out and serial aircraft engines had become almost impossible to produce in the necessary quantities. But this attempt was never completed. The third prototype, the very one, armed, with an 8-man crew, the most advanced of all the built machines, was destroyed in a bombing raid before this steam turbine ever had a chance to lift into the air even once. A technology that could have changed the perception of the future of aviation burned along with the fuselage, never receiving its flight test. 3 prototypes. One never lifted into the air at all. The second was bombed on the ground before its first flight. The third, the most advanced, was destroyed before the steam turbine had a chance to show what it was capable of. 7 years of work. Dozens of engineering solutions that were decades ahead of their time. And not one of these machines ever performed the single task for which it was originally created.